Between 1793 and 1815, Britain's Royal Navy fought nearly continuous war across every ocean on Earth. Their surgeons performed over 100,000 major amputations, often completing the entire procedure in under 90 seconds. The remarkable part isn't that so many sailors lost limbs. It's that so many of them survived. Tonight, we're descending below deck during a naval battle, where you'll learn to save lives with a bone saw, no anesthesia, and a ship pitching through cannon fire. The air smells like gunpowder and blood, the screaming never stops, and speed isn't cruelty. It's the only mercy you have to offer. Settle in. Dim the lights. And whatever you do, don't think too hard about what surgery meant before anyone understood germs. Let's ease into this gently, shall we? Before the screaming starts, before the bone saw comes out, before you're elbow deep in a sailor's shattered thigh, let's talk about how you got here. You are a surgeon aboard a Royal Navy ship of the line in 1805. Not a physician, mind you. The distinction matters enormously to everyone except dying men. Physicians attended university, studied Latin texts, and prescribed medicines with great philosophical confidence. Surgeons learned their trade like butchers, by apprenticeship, observation, and getting their hands dirty. You spent 7 years watching someone else cut before anyone let you hold a blade. The medical establishment looked down on you. Literally, physicians were gentlemen, surgeons were craftsmen. You learned anatomy by candlelight in dissection rooms that smelled like a crime scene, because legally speaking, they often were. Fresh corpses for training came from a rather narrow pool. Executed criminals, unclaimed bodies, and whatever the resurrection men dug up in the night. But here's the thing that will save your life and the lives of hundreds of sailors. You actually know what bodies look like inside. Physicians debated the theory of humors. You know where the femoral artery runs. Physicians prescribed bloodletting for everything from fevers to melancholy. You know that real bleeding, the kind that paints walls, requires immediate physical intervention, not philosophical discussion. You joined the Navy because the Navy paid surgeons properly, and because, frankly, civilian surgical practice meant competing with every barber in London who'd learned to pull teeth and lance boils. The Navy offered something better, a warrant. A guaranteed salary of around 5 shillings a day. And the chance to practice more surgery in a single afternoon than a London surgeon might see in a year. That last part sounds exciting until you realize what it actually means. Your medical chest contains the standard issue: amputation saws, tourniquets, catlings for cutting muscle, a trephine for drilling through skulls, bone nippers, bullet probes, forceps, silk ligatures, and an assortment of knives that would make a chef nervous. You have laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, which does absolutely nothing for surgical pain at the doses you can safely administer, but does help men sleep afterward, if they survive. You also have rum. Lots of rum. The Navy provides it. The rum is not for sterilization. Nobody knows that's a thing yet. The rum is for drinking, yours and theirs. The patient gets a few swallows before you start cutting. You get a few swallows after you've finished, assuming you still have hands steady enough to hold a cup. This is how we save lives in 1805. Settle in. The cannon are starting to fire. You hear the battle before you see it. The sound hits you 3 decks down in the orlop, the lowest deck of the ship, below the waterline where they've set up your surgery. Each cannon firing overhead sounds like God slamming a door. 74 guns on this ship, and when a full broadside goes off, the entire wooden world around you shudders like a horse trying to throw its rider. Sawdust sprinkles from the beams above. Lanterns swing. Shadows dance across the walls like something from a fever dream. The orlop deck was chosen for surgery because it's the safest place on the ship during battle. Below the waterline, enemy shot can't reach you directly. The wood surrounding you is thick, reinforced, designed to keep the ocean out. It will also keep you in. There's no natural light down here. There never is. The only illumination comes from lanterns, and you keep those shielded because an errant spark in a wooden ship full of gunpowder is not a surgical complication anyone survives. The flames flicker orange and yellow, casting everything in that sickly amber glow that makes blood look black and healthy flesh look jaundiced. The smell hits you next. Take a moment to appreciate it, because it's the smell of your entire professional life. Tar from the waterproofing, bilge water rising from below, the sour stench of hundreds of unwashed men crammed into wooden quarters for months at sea, smoke from the lanterns, and underneath it all, growing stronger by the minute, the copper sweetness of fresh blood. Your surgical table is a midshipman's sea chest, pulled into the center of the space and covered with canvas. It's barely long enough for a man to lie on. It's nowhere near wide enough for him to thrash. That's actually fine. You don't want him thrashing. Your loblolly boys will hold him down. Ah, yes. The loblolly boys. These are your surgical assistants, named after the porridge they feed to patients who can't chew. They're not trained medical professionals. They're sailors detailed to help you. Strong enough to restrain a screaming man and steady enough to not vomit while doing so. You hope the Navy didn't exactly conduct interviews. Around you, the cockpit fills with your supplies. Buckets of seawater for washing instruments between patients. A barrel of sand to soak up blood. You'll go through several barrels today. Piles of tourniquets, rolled bandages, sponges that will be used on a dozen different wounds before anyone thinks to rinse them. A leather strap for patients to bite, though most just scream through it anyway. And waiting, wrapped in canvas at the far end of the space, the wings. You haven't unwrapped those yet. The wings are what you call amputated limbs. After each surgery, the loblolly boys will carry them away and throw them overboard, but during battle there's no time. The wings pile up. By the end of a major engagement, you might have a dozen of them. Arms and legs, still warm, arranged neatly because there isn't room for chaos. Some surgeons have their boys throw the wings out a gun port between patients. You find this helps morale. Sailors being carried in for surgery don't need to see the accumulated evidence of their immediate future. The first casualty arrives while you're still organizing your instruments. He's carried by 2 messmates, his left arm dangling at an angle that human arms should not bend. A splinter wound. Not from enemy fire yet, but from your own cannon's recoil shattering part of the gun carriage. Oak splinters can be 2 feet long and sharp as any blade. Set him down, you say, and your voice sounds calmer than you feel. The battle is just beginning. The guns are still finding their range. What comes down those ladders in the next 4 hours will make this man's broken arm look like a paper cut. You have laudanum, a bone saw, and 90 seconds per amputation if you're fast. Welcome to naval surgery. Don't worry. It gets worse. The man on your table is 23 years old. You know this because he told you, gasping it out between screams while your low-lowly boys held him down. His name is Thomas. He's a forecastle man. He has a wife in Plymouth. You will forget all of this by the next patient. You have to. His right leg is destroyed below the knee. A cannonball didn't hit him directly. If it had, there would be nothing left to amputate. Instead, a spent shot bounced across the deck and caught him on the ricochet, moving just slowly enough to shatter bone without removing the limb entirely. The leg bends in 3 places it shouldn't. White bone fragments poke through the meat like broken china through a tablecloth. This is, in the parlance of naval surgery, a relatively straightforward case. Rum, you say, and someone presses a bottle to Thomas's lips. He drinks like a man dying of thirst, which is appropriate given what's about to happen. You give him 30 seconds, long enough to swallow, not long enough to vomit. Bite down. The leather strap goes between his teeth. Your low-lowly boys take their positions. 2 on his shoulders, 2 on the leg, 1 standing ready with the tourniquet. Thomas is crying now. Most of them do. The ones who don't are the ones who worry you. You have practiced this procedure hundreds of times. On cadavers in London, on the poor souls in naval hospitals, on men who died under your knife, and men who walked away. You know every step the way a musician knows a scale. And like a musician, you know that speed creates its own kind of grace. The tourniquet goes on first, high on the thigh. One of your boys twists it tight until the blood flow stops. Thomas screams through the leather. The pressure alone is agonizing. You don't wait for him to adjust. The amputation knife is not a saw. Not yet. First, you must cut through skin and muscle to reach the bone. Your blade is razor sharp. You honed it yourself this morning, the way you hone it every morning, because dull knives cause suffering and suffering costs time. 1 circular cut through the skin, about 4 inches above the wound. The flesh part's like wet cloth. Blood wells up. Dark venous blood mostly, the tourniquet holding back the arterial spray. Thomas is screaming continuously now, a sound that doesn't seem to require breathing. You've heard it so many times it barely registers. Now the muscle. You cut deeper, working your knife around the circumference of the leg, peeling flesh back toward the stump to be like you're coring an apple. The muscle resists more than skin. You can feel the texture change through the handle of your knife. Somewhere above you, a cannon fires and the ship shudders, and your hand does not move because you trained it not to. Retractor. A low-blowly boy pulls the cut flesh upward, away from the bone, exposing the tibia and fibula to your saw. This is why we cut higher than the wound, so there's enough skin and muscle left to fold over the stump and create a cushion. Surgeons who cut too close leave men with raw bone pressing against their mattresses for the rest of their lives. The saw now. It's a specialized instrument. A capital saw designed for exactly this purpose. The teeth are sharp and widely spaced to clear bone dust quickly. You position it against the exposed tibia and begin. The sound is something you never get used to. A wet grinding that vibrates up through your arms and into your teeth. Thomas has stopped screaming. He's either passed out or gone somewhere inside himself where screaming doesn't help. Either way, it's a mercy. 12 strokes through the tibia, 8 through the thinner fibula. The leg comes free in your loblolly boy's hands, and he carries it away without being told. You're not done. The tourniquet loosens and 2 arterial spurts announce the vessels you need to tie. You catch them with forceps. There's the femoral, there's the posterior tibial, and ligate each one with silk thread. These knots will stay inside Thomas forever, slowly dissolving over months while the vessel's scar closed. Sponge. You wipe the stump clean enough to see what you're doing. The muscle flaps fold down over the bone like closing a book. You stitch them in place with more silk, creating a cushion of flesh where a leg used to be. Time elapsed, 87 seconds. Thomas is alive. His pulse is fast but steady. The low-blowly boys are already carrying him to the recovery area. A section of the deck with blankets and laudanum and nothing else to offer. You rinse your hands in the bucket of seawater. The water is already pink. Next, you say. There are 19 men waiting on the ladder. Let's talk about speed, because speed is the only kindness you have to offer. Every second a patient spends on your table is a second of unimaginable agony. Anesthesia doesn't exist yet, won't exist for another 40 years. The best you can do is rum and laudanum, which dull the edges but cannot touch the center. When your saw bites into bone, your patient feels every tooth. The fast surgeons are the merciful ones. The famous Robert Liston, who will become the fastest surgeon in Britain, can amputate a leg in 28 seconds. You're not that fast. Nobody is. But you can manage 90 seconds for a clean amputation. 2 minutes for a complicated one. Every second beyond that is a second of screaming. Speed also saves lives in a more practical sense. The longer a wound stays open, the more blood pours out. The human body contains roughly 10 pints of blood. You can lose 2 before your vision starts graying, 4 before your heart can no longer keep pace with the demand. A slow surgeon watches his patients die of blood loss. A fast surgeon gives them a chance. This is why you practiced. This is why you spent those 7 years apprenticing, watching, learning the choreography of the knife and saw until you could perform it in your sleep. Because surgery is not about thinking. Surgery is about moving. The moment you hesitate is the moment someone dies. The casualties are coming faster now. The battle has fully engaged, and every broadside brings new horror down the ladder. Splinter wounds, massive wooden shards driven through torsos, limbs, faces. Cannonball injuries, limbs removed by physics, requiring only cleanup. Burns from powder explosions, flesh cooked in patterns that follow the splash. Crush injuries from falling masts, men pressed into shapes that shouldn't contain bones. You triage without thinking. This one has a chance. This one doesn't. This one might, if you're fast. You assign them places in line with gestures, your low-blowly boys learning your system on the fly. The dying go to the side, given rum and laudanum and the comfort of darkness. The savable go to your table. The questionable cases wait, and you pray the battle ends before you have to decide. Modern emergency rooms use the same system. They call it triage, from the French verb to sort. You just call it work. The man on your table now has lost his right arm to a cannonball. The limb was removed by the shot itself. Your job is cleanup, ligation, creating a stump that might heal rather than a wound that will certainly fester. This is actually faster than a surgical amputation. The violence did most of your work for you. 40 seconds. Ligate, sponge, stitch, next. The man after him took a splinter through the abdomen. You can see it protruding from his belly like a branch growing from soil that should not support life. You look at this wound, at the viscera visible around the wooden spike, and you make a decision that will haunt you for exactly as long as it takes for the next patient to arrive. Laudanum. As much as he wants. He will not survive abdominal surgery. No one survives abdominal surgery in 1805. The best you can offer is a gentle death. The low-blowly boys are learning not to look at your face when you say that word. The orlop deck is becoming difficult to navigate. You've been operating for 2 hours. In that time, you've performed 11 amputations, extracted splinters from 7 sailors, ligated wounds you lost count of, and pronounced 4 men beyond surgical help. The deck beneath your feet is no longer wood-colored. It's a swamp of blood and seawater, sawdust dissolving into pink mud that squelches with every step. The sand barrels are almost empty. You started with 3 packed tight with the absorbent grit that's supposed to give you traction and soak up the inevitable spillage. That sand is now scattered across the deck in a layer that's rapidly saturating. Your shoes. You stopped noticing your shoes an hour ago. Make sounds like someone walking through shallow pudding. The smell has evolved. What started as copper and tar has become something richer, something that coats the back of your throat and makes breathing feel like eating. Blood has its own ecology when there's enough of it. The iron oxidizes. The proteins begin to break down. Mixed with bilge water seeping up from below and the sweat of terrified men, it creates an atmosphere that would make a slaughterhouse supervisor take notes. Your surgical instruments swim in buckets of seawater that stopped being cleaned sometime around patient number 4. The amputation saw shows a thin film of tissue between its teeth. You've been rinsing it between uses, but rinsing isn't cleaning, and anyway, there isn't time to clean properly. The concept of sterilization is 40 years away. The concept of germ theory is almost 60 years away. You know none of this. You only know that wounds sometimes fester and men sometimes die of fever days after successful surgery, and the reason remains God's mysterious will. One of your loblolly boys vomits in the corner. You don't acknowledge it. He'll either recover and return to work, or he won't, and either way you cannot spare the attention. The pile of vomit joins the general morass underfoot. It hardly matters. The wings are stacking up. Your boys have stopped throwing them overboard. There's no time between casualties. No moment when someone can navigate to a gun port and dispose of the evidence. Instead, the amputated limbs accumulate in a canvas-wrapped pile near the far bulkhead. Arms and legs, still wearing their shoes and rings and tattoos, arranged with a neatness that seems almost respectful. You'll count them later. You always do. It's not required. The Navy doesn't track individual limbs, but you need to know. 14 wings so far. 7 left legs, 3 right legs, 4 arms. The asymmetry is typical. More men are right-handed, so they shield their right side. The cannons fire from left to right, so the gun crews expose their left legs. Mathematics of mutilation. You find it comforting to think in numbers. Another man comes down the ladder, screaming. Set him down. The noise never stops. Above you, the battle rages in thunder. Cannons fire in sequences that shake loose dust you didn't know existed in the timbers. The ship lurches and groans as broadsides impact the hull. Sometimes yours hitting them, sometimes theirs hitting you. Each impact sounds different. Your shots make a deep boom followed by creaking celebration. Their shots make a crack followed by screaming. But the sounds that fill your surgery are closer, more intimate, and infinitely worse. The screaming is constant. Not one continuous note. That would be easier. But a symphony of agony that shifts and swells with each new patient. The man on your table screams in soprano, his voice breaking on notes no adult male should be able to reach. The man waiting on the ladder screams in baritone, a sound like grief personified. The man in the recovery area moans in something below hearing, a vibration you feel more than hear. Your loblolly boys have stopped speaking. They communicate in gestures now, in taps and nods, because words cannot compete with the ambient horror. You give instructions in the same sign language of necessity. Tourniquet, saw, ligature, sponge. Next. Your hands speak because your voice has given up. Underneath the screaming, there is a sound you've learned to ignore. The prayers. Men pray constantly down here. To Christ, to Mary, to saints whose names you've never heard. They pray in English and Irish and Welsh and languages you don't recognize from the foreign sailors who've ended up in the King's Navy through means best not examined. The prayers blend into a murmur that sounds almost peaceful, if you don't listen to the words. One man recites the Lord's Prayer on a loop, the words blurring together until they become nonsense syllables. Another begs for his mother in a voice that makes him sound 8 years old. Another curses God with a creativity that would be impressive under other circumstances. None of this affects your work. You can't afford to hear it. The saw has its own voice, a rhythmic grinding that marks time like a metronome. 12 strokes for a femur, 8 for a tibia, 6 for a humerus. You could play music to these counts. Someone probably has. And beneath everything, under the screaming and praying and sawing, there's the ship itself. Wood groaning against water, ropes singing with tension. The heartbeat of a vessel built to float and fight and survive, doing its job while you do yours. You've been operating for 4 hours. The screaming has become white noise. Here's the remarkable thing about naval surgery. It works. Not always. Not even most of the time, depending on how you count. But enough of the time that it's worth doing. Enough of the time that men who should be dead are walking around Plymouth and Portsmouth and every other naval port, missing limbs but very much alive. The survival rate for amputation in the Royal Navy hovers around 70%. 70% of men who lose a limb to your saw will survive the experience. This is not a typo. This is not wishful thinking. This is documented in naval hospital records across hundreds of thousands of cases. You find this number miraculous, and you're right to. Consider what you're working with. No anesthesia, no antisepsis. No antisepsis, no understanding. No antibiotics for the gangrene that sets in 40% of the time. No blood transfusions for the men who lose too much. No IV fluids. No nothing except rum, silk thread, and speed. And yet, 70%. The secret is selection bias. The men who make it to your table have already survived being hit by cannon fire. They've survived the initial blood loss. They've survived being carried through a battle to the orlop deck. By the time they reach you, they've proven themselves resilient enough to have a chance. The other secret is speed. A 90-second amputation gives infection less time to set in. A tight ligature stops bleeding faster than hoping. A clean stump. As clean as you can manage with unwashed instruments and blood-soaked hands. Heals better than a ragged wound left to fester. Modern surgeons study these numbers with something approaching disbelief. How did they do it? How did men survive such brutal conditions? The answer is complicated, but part of it is simply this. The human body wants to live. Given half a chance, given wounds closed and bleeding stopped, the body will fight with everything it has. Of course, 30% of your patients will not survive. They'll die of blood loss on your table, or shock in the hours after, or infection in the days following, or gangrene in the weeks beyond. 30% is not a small number when you're operating on 60 men in an afternoon. 18 deaths. 18 men who trusted you to save them and discovered that trust has limits. You don't think about the 30% while you're working. You can't. Each patient is a 100% chance of survival until they're not. And your job is to give them every possible opportunity to be in the 70. The mathematics of aggregate outcomes is for admirals and historians. You're just trying to save the man in front of you. The man in front of you right now has survived a splinter through his shoulder. The wood is out. You extracted it with forceps while he screamed hymns, and the wound is clean enough to close. He'll probably keep the arm. He'll probably live. 70%. Laudanum and rest. Next. The battle pauses, not stops. Naval battles don't stop until someone strikes their colors or sinks, but pauses, the way storms sometimes pause to gather strength. Both fleets are repositioning. The cannons go quiet. The ship steadies. You have perhaps 15 minutes. The low-blowly boys are using this time to clear the orlop deck. Wings go out the gun port, finally. 23 of them, splashing into the sea one by one. The bloodied sand gets shoveled into buckets and dumped. Fresh sand goes down. It will be pink within minutes of the battle resuming. You use this time to sit. Just sit. On a powder barrel near the ladder, in the swaying lamplight, while the ship rocks gently and the screaming fades to moaning. Your hands are shaking. You notice this distantly. The way you notice weather, they always shake afterward. They'll stop when the next patient arrives. Someone hands you rum. You drink it without tasting. The alcohol burns going down, and you're grateful for sensation that isn't other people's pain. The man nearest you, a sailor waiting for surgery on a crushed foot, watches you drink. His eyes are huge in the lantern light, terrified, but he doesn't look away. He's studying you the way sailors study weather. Will I keep it? He asks. The foot. He means the foot. You look at the foot. It's been crushed by something heavy. A fallen block, maybe, or a rolling cannon. The bones are shattered inside the skin, which has turned the purple-black of internal bleeding. He cannot move his toes. He can barely feel you touching him. I don't know yet, you say, which is honest. I'll try. This is all you can offer. You'll try. You're good at your job, better than most. But your job has limits that no amount of skill can transcend. Some wounds heal and some don't, and the difference isn't always effort. The sailor nods. He seems to find this answer acceptable, or at least not surprising. He's been in the Navy long enough to know that certainty is a luxury. My wife makes lace, he says, in Whitby. She'll need me walking to help with the shop. You don't know what to say to this, so you say nothing. His wife in Whitby, her lace and her shop, exist in a world that has nothing to do with this deck. These shadows, the blood still drying on your apron. You cannot carry both worlds at once. Above you, someone shouts an order. The pause is ending. The fleets have repositioned. The cannons are rolling back into place. When this is over, you tell the sailor, I'll look at your foot properly. He nods again. He believes you. You finish the rum and stand up. The shaking in your hands has stopped. Stations, you tell the low-blowly boys. The cannons begin again. The second half of the battle brings the injuries that make amputation look kind. Head wounds arrive first. A sailor takes a splinter through the skull. Not deep enough to kill instantly, but deep enough that brain matter is visible through the hole. You can do nothing for him except laudanum. He dies singing a song about a mermaid, the lyrics getting slower and less coherent until they stop. Abdominal wounds follow. The cannonballs that miss limbs tend to find torsos, and the torso is where surgery goes to die. You can amputate a leg. You cannot amputate a perforated intestine. Men with gut wounds die slowly of infection and internal bleeding over hours or days. The best you can do is make those hours comfortable. One sailor arrives with his intestines in his hands. He's holding them, piled in his arms like laundry, trying to push them back into the hole in his belly. He's still conscious. He's still talking. "Can you fix it?" he asks. "Can you put them back?" You can put them back. You cannot fix them. The peritoneum has been breached, which means bacteria from his bowels are already spreading through his abdominal cavity. Peritonitis will set in within hours. He will die in agony within days. You put them back anyway. You stitch the wound closed, knowing it will reopen. You give him laudanum, knowing it won't be enough. You lie to him, telling him he might recover, because the truth is not a kindness you can afford. He dies 36 hours later, exactly as you predicted. The burns are almost worse than the wounds. Powder explosions cook men alive, leaving them skinless and screaming, their flesh hanging in sheets that peel away when you try to help. There is no treatment for severe burns in 1805. There is barely a treatment for severe burns now. You wrap them in cloth and give them rum and wait for shock to take them. And then there are the cases that haunt you most, the ones you could save if only you had time. A young midshipman, he can't be more than 14, arrives with a wound that needs debriding. Not amputation, just careful cleaning, removal of dead tissue, proper bandaging. Given an hour and clean instruments, you could save his arm and probably his life. You don't have an hour. You have 6 men waiting with injuries that will kill them in the next 10 minutes if you don't intervene. The midshipman's wound is survivable. Theirs are not. Bandage and wait, you tell your loblolly boy. The midshipman waits. The infection sets in. By the time you can return to him, the wound has gone septic, and the arm must come off after all. He survives the amputation. He does not survive the fever that follows. You think about him for years. That hour you didn't have. That arm you could have saved. But at the time, you don't think. You can't. You move to the next patient, the one who will die without you, and you do what you can do. 63 patients today. 18 deaths on the table or shortly after. 23 amputations. An unknown number who will die in the coming weeks of infection, fever, gangrene. The battle is over. Your side won. You're not sure if that matters. The silence is almost harder than the noise. When the guns stop, when the cheering starts, when the ship settles into the relative calm of victory, you're left standing in an abattoir of your own making. The orlop deck looks like something from a nightmare. Blood congealed on every surface, surgical instruments scattered on crimson-stained canvas, the smell so thick you could chew it. Your hands are steady now. They stopped shaking somewhere around patient 40. The adrenaline that kept you operating for 6 hours has faded into something flatter. A gray exhaustion that makes movement feel like swimming through tar. The Loblolly boys are cleaning. They've developed a system without being told. One group handles instruments. Another clears debris. A third tends to patients in recovery. Nobody speaks. Speaking would require acknowledging what just happened, and nobody is ready for that. You move through the recovery area, checking your survivors. 23 amputees, their stumps wrapped in cloth that's already spotting red. The ones who are conscious watch you with eyes that hold no accusation. They know you did what you could. The ones who are unconscious are the lucky ones. The sailor with the crushed foot is here. You saved it barely. Hours of careful work between acute cases, splinting the bones you could align and hoping the rest would heal. He'll walk again. He might even walk without a limp if the bone's set properly. Thank you, he says when you check his bandages. You don't know how to accept thanks for something that was simply your job. Tell your wife, you say instead. Tell her you're coming home. He starts crying then, silent tears that run down into his beard. You move on. You have 17 other patients to check. The dead are a separate project. 18 bodies, waiting to be sewn into their hammocks with cannonballs at their feet and thrown overboard with whatever prayers the captain can manage? You don't know all their names. You operated on most of them. You remember their wounds better than their faces. Someone will write letters. The captain, probably, or the chaplain. Families in England will receive news that their husband, their father, their son died bravely in battle. The letters will not mention screaming. They will not mention the smell. They will not mention that you did everything right and it wasn't enough. The Navy keeps statistics. You'll add your numbers to the casualty reports. Patients treated. Surgeries performed, lives saved, lives lost. The numbers will become part of a larger picture, aggregate data that tells admirals how the war is going. The numbers won't mention Thomas from Plymouth, who lost his leg in 90 seconds and survived. They won't mention the midshipman whose arm you could have saved. They won't mention the way blood looks black in lantern light. Some things aren't for reports. The war continues. It will continue for 10 more years. And then it will end, and 100,000 maimed sailors will return to a country that doesn't quite know what to do with them. You continue too. This was not your last battle. It wasn't even your worst. There will be engagements where the casualties number in the hundreds, where you operate until you hallucinate, where the orlop deck fills so completely with the dying that you must choose who lives based on nothing more than surgical logistics. You will get faster. Your amputations will drop below 90 seconds. Your mortality rate will improve slightly as you learn the tricks that distinguish good outcomes from bad. Tourniquets placed higher, ligatures tied tighter, stumps cut with more margin. Each technique paid for with someone else's suffering. You will also get slower in another sense. The shaking that used to stop will start lasting longer. The faces you couldn't save will accumulate in your memory like sediment. You'll find yourself drinking rum before battles, not after. And you'll tell yourself it's for steadiness. The Navy surgeons who survive their careers often end up in private practice, using skills they learned on the gun decks to serve wealthy patients who have never seen real violence. They become respected, successful, knighted sometimes. They don't talk about the orlop deck. You won't either. The people who haven't been there can't understand, and the people who have don't need explanations. But here's what you carry out of that wooden hell, along with the nightmares and the drinking and the hands that never quite stop shaking. You saved lives. Imperfectly, brutally, with tools and knowledge that would make modern surgeons weep. But you saved them. Men who should have died walked out of your surgery. Men who should have lost limbs kept them. Men who were written off as hopeless woke up and asked for water and eventually went home. 70% survival. In an age before anesthesia, before antisepsis, before anything resembling modern medicine. 70%? Through nothing but speed and skill and sheer determination to not let the bastards die. Modern emergency medicine stands on foundations you built. The triage systems, the golden hour, the idea that speed saves lives. All of it traces back to surgeons like you, working in lantern light with bone saws and silk thread. The trauma surgeons in hospitals today are your inheritors. When they work through mass casualty events, when they operate in conditions of chaos and scarcity, they're doing what you did. Better, yes. With better tools and better knowledge and better outcomes. But the same essential thing. Fighting death with their hands, one patient at a time. You didn't know you were building a legacy. You were just trying to get through the afternoon. So, could you survive as a Napoleonic naval surgeon? The honest answer is no. You could not. Not because you lack courage. You have plenty sitting here in the 21st century reading about horrors that make horror movies look quaint. Not because you lack intelligence. Naval surgeons weren't geniuses, just craftsmen with steady hands and strong stomachs. Not even because you lack training. The basic techniques of amputation can be learned in a weekend, if you're motivated. You couldn't survive because survival required a kind of adaptation that modern humans have forgotten how to do. The ability to hear screaming and not react. The ability to feel a saw grind through bone and keep your hand steady. The ability to watch men die, not peacefully, not quickly, but in agony and terror. And then move to the next patient without pausing to grieve. The ability to live inside horrors so completely that they become normal. Modern soldiers learn this adaptation, sometimes in wars that test the limits of human resilience. Modern trauma surgeons learn it in hospitals where the casualties never stop. But most of us never face conditions that require such comprehensive psychological restructuring. The surgeons who served in the Age of Sail weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men who learned to do extraordinary things because the alternative was letting everyone die. They drank too much. They had nightmares. They developed what we would now recognize as PTSD in an age that had no name for such things. But they showed up. Battle after battle, year after year, they descended into the orlop deck and did impossible work under impossible conditions. They gave the wounded a chance they shouldn't have had. That's what we should remember, sitting in our safe houses with our safe lives and our safe assumptions about human limits. Not the horror. Though the horror deserves remembering. Not the statistics. Though the statistics tell their own story. But the fact that ordinary people facing unimaginable circumstances found ways to be extraordinary. The bone saws are in museums now. The ships are rotting at the bottom of every ocean. The surgeons are dust, their names forgotten except by historians who dig through naval records looking for patterns. But somewhere in every emergency room, every trauma center, every field hospital where someone cuts into flesh to save a life, the ghost of those surgeons lingers. Speed as mercy, skill as compassion. The stubborn refusal to let death win without a fight. You couldn't survive the orlop deck, but you can carry what happened there. The lessons, the legacy, the proof that humans are capable of more than we imagine. The mask goes on, and you become no one. This is the fundamental transaction of the Venetian Carnival, the unspoken contract that transformed a small Italian city-state into Europe's most elaborate theater of anonymity. For 3 months every year, from the day after Christmas until the beginning of Lent, Venice became a place where identity dissolved like salt in the lagoon. The masks themselves were works of art and psychological engineering. The Bada, the most common style, featured a stark white face with a jutting chin that allowed the wearer to eat and drink without removing it. The design wasn't accidental. A mask you never have to take off is a mask that never breaks character. Nobles wore them. Merchants wore them. Prostitutes wore them. Priests wore them, though they weren't supposed to. The smell of Carnival was leather and sweat and canal water. That distinctive Venetian perfume of salt and decay that visitors either loved or fled from. Mask makers' shops lined the narrow streets near San Marco, their windows displaying faces without souls. The long-nosed Medico della Peste, the golden sun faces, the demon masks with their curling horns. Every face a possibility. Every possibility a permission. And permission was the point. Venice in the 17th and 18th centuries operated on a knife's edge of social control. The city was run by a closed aristocracy, a few hundred families whose names appeared in the Golden Book, and whose power was absolute. Below them, a rigid hierarchy of merchants, craftsmen, servants, and the poor. Everyone knew their place. Everyone performed their station. Except during Carnival. The mask created what the Venetians called incognito, a legal and social fiction of anonymity. A masked figure could not be formally recognized, even if everyone knew perfectly well who they were. This meant a nobleman could gamble in a commoner's casino without scandal. A merchant's wife could take a lover without accusation. A servant could speak freely to his master's face, and the master could not officially acknowledge the insult. The rules were elaborate and universally understood. You did not unmask someone against their will. You did not reference what happened in mask when the masks came off. You pretended with absolute commitment that the masked figure and the unmasked person were entirely different beings. This was not hypocrisy. This was infrastructure. Venice needed the Carnival the way a pressure cooker needs its valve. The rigid social structure that made the Republic stable also made it suffocating. 3 months of sanctioned chaos prevented the year-round pressure from building to explosion. The authorities understood this perfectly. They didn't merely tolerate Carnival. They required it. The streets filled at dusk. Torches flickered in their brackets, casting dancing shadows on the water. Musicians played on every corner. Not organized performances, but spontaneous eruptions of violin and drum. Wine flowed from public fountains, a gift from the city's wealthier families who understood that drunk citizens were happy citizens. And everywhere the masks. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. A population transformed into a single anonymous mass, moving through streets grown suddenly unfamiliar, as if the city itself had put on a disguise. The tourists came from across Europe to witness this spectacle. English lords on their grand tour, German merchants seeking business connections, French aristocrats escaping the tedium of Versailles. They arrived expecting decadence and found something stranger, a city that had institutionalized the temporary death of the self. For 3 months, no one was anyone. And in that absence of identity, everything became possible. What did people actually do during Carnival? The short answer is everything they couldn't do the rest of the year. Gambling was the obsession that crossed all class lines. Licensed gambling houses operated openly during Carnival season, their tables crowded with masked figures pushing fortunes across the felt. The most famous, the Ridotto di San Moise, occupied a palazzo near San Marco and catered to anyone with money to lose. Nobles ruined themselves there. So did merchants, craftsmen, and visitors who arrived wealthy and left begging passage home. The church officially condemned gambling. The church also operated lotteries. Venice understood contradiction. Sex was equally available and equally stratified. The city's courtesans were legendary throughout Europe. Educated, cultured women who could discuss philosophy and poetry before and after providing other services. They entertained in elegant apartments, their prices reflecting their accomplishments. Below them, ordinary prostitutes worked the streets and taverns, their services cheaper and more straightforward. During Carnival, the boundaries blurred. Respectable women, masked and anonymous, could visit places they'd never acknowledge entering. Men whose wives would never permit infidelity found that masked encounters somehow didn't count. The city's sexual economy expanded to absorb demand that existed year-round, but could only be expressed during the season of permission. Theater flourished, not just in the opera houses, though Venice had more of those per capita than any city in Europe, but in the streets themselves. Commedia dell'arte troupes performed on temporary stages their stock characters. Harlequin, Pantalone, Columbina, becoming part of Carnival's visual language. Everyone was performing. The plays were just more honest about it. And underneath all the obvious pleasures ran a current of something harder to name. Freedom, maybe, or its simulation. The chance to be someone else, somewhere else, even briefly. The mask made it possible. The city made it safe. The Ridotto di San Moise opened its doors at precisely 9 in the evening, and by 10, every table was surrounded. The building had once been a private palazzo, and traces of its aristocratic past survived in the frescoed ceilings and marble floors. But the atmosphere was pure casino, tense, electric, smelling of sweat and wine, and the peculiar metallic scent of coins changing hands too quickly. The games were simple by design. Bezzetta dominated. A card game where players bet against a banker, drawing cards and hoping to match the winning suit. The odds favored the house, as odds always do, but the margins were thin enough to keep hope alive. A lucky streak could transform a modest stake into a fortune. The unlucky streaks were more common, but losers rarely discussed them. The masks made the experience surreal. Faces frozen in identical expressions surrounded each table. The white-beaked botta, the more elaborate volto that covered the entire face. Occasional exotic specimens from the mask maker's more creative workshops. Only the hands moved, pushing coins and chips, trembling slightly or rock steady depending on what the cards revealed. Servants circulated with wine. Always wine, never water. Because hydrated gamblers made clearer decisions, and clearer decisions meant less profit for the house. The Ridotto owners understood behavioral economics centuries before the term existed. They knew that tired, drunk, anonymous gamblers would bet more than they intended and stay longer than they planned. The sounds layered over each other. The slap of cards, the clink of coins, the murmur of bets, the occasional sharp intake of breath when fortune turned. Conversations happened in fragments. Masked voices discussing sums, odds, systems guaranteed to work that somehow never did. Social rank dissolved at the tables. A nobleman might find himself betting against his own servant, neither acknowledging the other, both pretending the encounter was between strangers. This was the Ridotto's genius and its function. The gambling house was a laboratory for equality, a space where only money mattered. Some people won. The Ridotto's records, such as survive, suggest that roughly 1 in 10 visitors left with more than they brought. These winners fueled the enterprise. Their stories spread through Venice's coffee houses and salons, drawing new players eager to test their own luck. The other 9 in 10 left poorer. Some significantly poorer. The Venetian archives contain petitions from ruined families, requests for debt forgiveness, occasionally accusations that the games were rigged. The government investigated periodically and always concluded that the riddoti operated fairly. This was technically true. The games didn't need to be rigged. Mathematics did the work. The greatest ridotto stories involved ruin on a spectacular scale. Counts who wagered their estates and lost. Merchants who bet their entire shipping ventures on a single hand. Young men who arrived at Carnival with inheritances and left before Lent with nothing. These stories served a social function. They were warnings, certainly, but they were also entertainment. Proof that Carnival's transformations could be permanent, that the mask's permission extended to self-destruction. Not everyone gambled for money. Some came to the ridotto for the atmosphere, the anonymity, the chance to observe human nature stripped of its social armor. Writers gathered material. Artists sketched masked faces by candlelight. Philosophers debated whether a person gambling anonymously revealed their true character or performed yet another role. The doors closed at dawn. Masked figures stumbled into the gray Venetian morning, some richer, most poorer, all transformed by the night's experiences. They'd return tomorrow or the day after. Carnival lasted 3 months, and the ridotto never ran out of customers. The Senate debated closing the gambling houses periodically. They always decided against it. The ridotti generated tax revenue, employed hundreds of servants, and concentrated vice in controllable locations. Better this, the senators reasoned, than gambling spreading into private homes where it couldn't be monitored. Besides, the senators gambled too. They just did it in private rooms, away from the common tables. The masks kept everyone's secrets. Behind every pleasure industry stands an army of workers, and Carnival was no exception. The mask makers began their preparations months in advance. The Machinery Guild controlled production, ensuring quality and collecting fees from anyone who wanted to sell masks legally. Their workshops operated year-round, stockpiling inventory for the season when demand would outstrip any possible supply. The work was skilled but brutal. Mask making involved papier-mâché or leather molded over clay forms, painted with lead-based pigments, decorated with feathers, gems, and gilt. The lead was slowly poisoning the craftsmen, though they wouldn't have used that word. They called it painter's colic and accepted it as occupational hazard. The alternative was poverty. Servants' labor multiplied during Carnival. The great households required armies of footmen, cooks, cleaners, and valets to support the endless round of entertainments. These workers faced 3 months of minimal sleep, constant demands, and the particular exhaustion of maintaining invisible efficiency while their employers played. The courtesans occupied a more complex position. The most successful among them, the courtigiane honest or honest courtesans, lived well, maintaining elegant apartments and intellectual salons. They were artists in their own right, trained in music, poetry, and conversation. Their clients paid for companionship as much as sex, and the best courtesans commanded prices that would astonish modern observers. But most women in Venice's sex trade were not courtigianes. They were ordinary prostitutes working from rented rooms or street corners, their prices low, their protections minimal. During Carnival, demand spiked and so did their hours. The mask that liberated their clients offered no equivalent freedom to them. They worked unmasked, identifiable, vulnerable. The city's records document the costs with bureaucratic precision. Arrests for prostitution-related offenses tripled during Carnival. So did cases of venereal disease reported to the city's hospitals. The sexual freedom celebrated in tourist accounts had a shadow economy of exploitation and illness. Musicians faced their own grinding reality. The gondoliers who serenaded passengers through the canals, the violinists on street corners, the opera singers in the theaters, all worked continuous shifts during the season. A successful carnival could sustain a musician for the entire year. A failed one meant poverty until the next season. Competition was fierce and occasionally violent. The best performance spots were contested territory. Musicians guarded their corners jealously, and disputes sometimes escalated beyond words. The City Watch spent significant effort during Carnival preventing entertainment-related violence. The food workers suffered most invisibly. Bakers started their shifts at midnight to ensure fresh bread for the morning crowds. Butchers processed meat in quantities that strained the city's limited refrigeration. Ice imported at great expense from the Alpine mountains. Fishermen worked the lagoon in all weather, knowing that Carnival's endless parties required endless seafood. None of these workers wore masks. They moved through the festival as themselves, identifiable and accountable, serving the anonymous pleasures of their social betters. The transformation that Carnival offered was not for them. This isn't to say they didn't participate. Servants stole moments to join the street celebrations. Workers pooled resources for their own modest entertainments. The mask's democracy had limits, but it wasn't entirely fictional. A craftsman with saved wages could don a bata and spend an evening at the Ridotto, indistinguishable from the nobles around him. But he'd wake the next morning to his workshop, his lead-painted masks, his slowly accumulating illness. The nobleman would wake to breakfast served in bed. Carnival was freedom. It was also work. The difference depended entirely on which side of the mask you stood. The Venetian government understood this calculus perfectly. They maintained detailed records of the labor force required to sustain the festival, ensuring adequate supplies of workers in each category. When Mask Makers Guild membership dropped below critical levels, the Senate offered incentives to attract new apprentices. When the courtesan population declined, usually due to disease, the authorities quietly reduced enforcement of anti-prostitution laws to encourage migration from other cities. The machine required maintenance. Venice had been maintaining it for centuries. By the festival's peak, in the weeks before Lent, the city consumed resources at rates that would have seemed impossible during normal times. Wine imports quadrupled. Candle consumption increased tenfold. The food markets expanded into every available square, vendors selling everything from roasted chestnuts to elaborate pastries shaped like masks. And through it all, The workers kept working, invisible hands sustaining visible pleasures. The true currency of Carnival wasn't ducats, it was permission. Every transaction, examined closely, was really a purchase of temporary freedom. The mask itself cost a few coins, but what it represented was priceless. The chance to act without consequence, to speak without attribution, to desire without shame. The Ridotto charged admission and took a cut of every bet. But gamblers weren't really paying for cards and chips. They were paying for the experience of risk in a consequence-free environment. What happened at the Ridotto stayed at the Ridotto. The mask ensured it. The courtesans charged for their time, their conversation, their bodies. But their clients were also purchasing discretion, the guarantee that masked encounters would never surface in unmasked society. A man could maintain his respectable marriage while visiting courtesans during Carnival, and neither relationship acknowledged the other. Even the street performers understood this economy. The coins that clinked into their hats rewarded skill, certainly, but also collaboration in the collective fiction. The musician pretended his audience was sophisticated. The audience pretended to be transformed by the music. Everyone benefited from the mutual performance. This economy of permission had grown over centuries, refined by generations of Venetians who understood exactly what they were selling. The masks, the costumes, the rules of incognito. These weren't spontaneous traditions. They were carefully engineered products, optimized to extract maximum value from humanity's hunger to be temporarily free. Venice sold freedom the way other cities sold cloth or spices. And Europe bought it, eagerly, every year. Carnival's aesthetic reached far beyond masks. The entire city transformed, and the transformation required technologies both physical and social. Costume was status and disguise simultaneously. The wealthy commissioned elaborate outfits from Venice's renowned tailors. Silk cloaks, embroidered doublets, dresses that cost more than a craftsman earned in years. These costumes weren't meant to hide identity. Everyone recognized expensive fabric. They were meant to signal that the wearer could afford to play at anonymity. The poor improvised. Second-hand shops sold last year's fashions to this year's social climbers. Clever seamstresses could transform old curtains into passable cloaks. The effect wasn't as impressive as noble costume, but it was sufficient. In torchlight and crowds, approximate elegance served nearly as well as the genuine article. Theater companies supplied the city's most elaborate transformations. The Commedia dell'arte characters, recognizable across Europe, populated every corner during Carnival. Harlequin in his diamond-patterned suit. Pantalone, the greedy merchant. Columbina, the clever servant. These stock figures offered ready-made identities for anyone uncertain how to inhabit their anonymity. The opera houses competed for spectacle. Venice had 7 major theaters during Carnival's peak, each offering different genres. Serious opera at one, comic opera at another, experimental works at a third. The productions deployed elaborate stage machinery, clouds that descended carrying singers, trapdoors that swallowed villains, painted backdrops that transformed scenes in seconds. Audiences attended masked, of course. This created a strange doubling. Actors performing characters for an audience itself performing anonymity. The line between stage and street dissolved. Everyone was acting. The visual arts documented and fed the phenomenon. Painters captured carnival scenes for wealthy patrons, creating images that would circulate throughout Europe and attract next year's tourists. The most famous artists commanded enormous fees for works depicting the festival's distinctive atmosphere, masked crowds, lamplit canals, the particular Venetian combination of beauty and decay. These images were advertisements as much as art. They promised transformation, excitement, escape from ordinary identity. They worked. By the 18th century, Carnival attracted visitors from every European nation. English writers described it in fascinated detail. German philosophers analyzed its social functions. French aristocrats imported its traditions, creating Parisian imitations that never quite captured the original's intensity. Venice had become a brand, and Carnival was its signature product. The most dangerous moment of Carnival wasn't the peak of revelry. It was the ending. Ash Wednesday arrived with church bells at midnight, and the transformation reversed. Masks came off. Costumes were stored or sold. The gambling houses closed their doors. The courtesans returned to their apartments, their clients to their families. The transition required careful management. 3 months of anonymous behavior had accumulated debts: financial, social, emotional. Some could be discharged easily. Gambling losses settled with cash. Affairs ended by mutual agreement. Others proved more complicated. The Venetian courts saw a spike in litigation every spring. Breach of promise cases. Disputed debts. Occasionally, accusations of crimes committed during Carnival by figures who were identified too late. The law struggled to accommodate the festival's fictions. How do you prosecute someone for actions committed when they legally didn't exist? The church provided a framework for transition. Lent's disciplines, fasting, confession, penance, offered a pathway back to ordinary identity. You confessed what you'd done while masked. You received absolution. You returned to being yourself. This wasn't mere ritual. The psychological transition from anonymous freedom to accountable respectability required assistance. Without Lent's structured return, many people might have struggled to resume their ordinary lives. Some didn't manage it regardless. Every year, a handful of Carnival participants failed to reintegrate. People who had discovered something about themselves during the festival that they couldn't unfind, or who had accumulated consequences too severe to discharge. The Venetian archives record them obliquely. Names that disappear from city records after Carnival. Families that relocate suddenly. Occasional scandals that force public acknowledgement of masked behavior. These were the cracks in the system, the cases where the mask's permission proved too absolute. But for most participants, Ash Wednesday marked a clean break. The mask went into storage. The costume went to the second-hand dealer. Ordinary life resumed. Until next year. Carnival ended the way it began. Suddenly, completely by collective agreement. The morning of Ash Wednesday, Venice looked exhausted. The streets that had thronged with masked figures lay empty, littered with debris from the final night's celebrations. Wine bottles, broken masks, the occasional lost shoe. The city's cleaning crews worked through the dawn, erasing the physical evidence of 3 months' transformation. The canal water, always dubious, turned particularly foul in Carnival's aftermath. 3 months of concentrated human activity had overwhelmed the tidal flows that normally flushed the system. The smell would linger for weeks, a nasal reminder of excess. The economic accounting began immediately. The Ridotto owners tallied their profits. Substantial, almost always, regardless of how individual gamblers had fared. The mask makers inventoried remaining stock and began planning next year's designs. The courtesans reviewed their client lists, calculating which relationships might continue beyond the season. For visitors, departure was often hasty. Those who had lost money wanted to escape their shame. Those who had found trouble wanted to outrun it. The roads leading out of Venice filled with carriages, the passengers quieter than they'd been arriving. The Venetians themselves returned to ordinary life with practiced efficiency. Shops that had extended their hours returned to normal schedules. Churches filled for Ash Wednesday services, the congregations notably subdued. The rhythm of daily commerce, fishing, trading, crafting, resumed as if Carnival had never happened. Except it had happened, and everyone remembered. The Venetian system depended on a particular kind of collective amnesia. What happened in mask stayed in mask. This was the rule, and it worked only if everyone committed to it. The nobleman who had gambled alongside his servant pretended not to recognize him. The married woman who had taken a lover returned to her husband's bed without acknowledgement. This wasn't denial. It was social technology, refined over centuries. Venice had learned that human beings could sustain 2 separate identities, masked and unmasked, if society provided the structures to keep them apart. The structures held mostly. Carnival marriages sometimes proved harder to forget than anticipated. Children sometimes appeared 9 months after the festival, their paternity carefully unexamined. Old friendships sometimes cooled when masked encounters revealed uncomfortable truths. But these were exceptions. The system was designed to contain them. And so Venice rested, recovered, and began preparing for the next carnival. The mask makers mixed new batches of paint. The casino owners repaired their tables. The city's entire pleasure infrastructure entered maintenance mode, rebuilding capacity for the next season of sanctioned excess. 3 months of anonymity. 9 months of preparation. The cycle had continued for centuries. It would continue for centuries more, until Napoleon's armies arrived and dissolved the Republic entirely. But that ending was still in the future. For now, Venice dreamed of masks. And the masks dreamed of Venice. Genghis Khan did not conquer the world with brutality. He conquered it with mail delivery. This is not the story you learned. The version that survives in popular imagination features pyramids of skulls, cities burned to ash, rivers of blood flowing across the steppes. And those things happened. The Mongol conquests were genuinely horrific, responsible for death tolls that historians still debate, but generally placed somewhere between catastrophic and apocalyptic. But here's the problem with the brutality narrative. It doesn't explain anything. Lots of armies were brutal. The Assyrians built their entire brand around creative cruelty. The Romans crucified thousands along their roads as a matter of policy. Medieval European warfare featured routine massacre of civilian populations. Brutality was the norm, not the exception. What made the Mongols different wasn't their willingness to kill. It was their ability to coordinate killing across distances that should have been impossible. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Poland. Roughly 9,000 miles, or about a quarter of the Earth's circumference. No previous empire had come close to this scale. None would match it until the British Empire, and the British had steamships, telegraphs, and railways. The Mongols had horses, and yet they administered this impossible territory with remarkable efficiency. Orders issued in Karakorum reached commanders in Persia within weeks. Intelligence about rebellions in China arrived at the Khan's court faster than the rebels could organize. Trade goods moved safely across continents, protected by a system that made banditry suicidal. The answer is boring, which is why it doesn't make it into the movies. The Mongols built a postal system. They called it the Yam, and it was the most sophisticated communication network the world had ever seen. It's the reason they won, far more than any battlefield tactic or terror campaign. Understanding the Yam means understanding something counterintuitive about conquest. Information matters more than violence. An army that knows what's happening 3,000 miles away can respond to threats before they materialize. An army operating blind gets surprised, outmaneuvered, and eventually defeated. The Mongols were never surprised. Their enemies were surprised constantly. By armies appearing from unexpected directions. By coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. By a level of strategic awareness that seemed almost supernatural. It wasn't supernatural. It was infrastructure. The boring kind of infrastructure. Way stations and fresh horses and relay riders who never stopped moving. The kind of system that doesn't make for exciting stories but makes empires possible. Let's talk about how mail delivery conquered the world. To appreciate what the Mongols accomplished, you need to understand what distance meant before modern transportation. A human being walking at a sustainable pace covers roughly 20 miles per day. A horse ridden carefully to avoid exhaustion might manage 40. These numbers hadn't changed since the domestication of the horse thousands of years earlier, and they wouldn't change until the invention of the railroad. This meant that information traveled slowly, agonizingly slowly by modern standards. A message from Rome to the empire's eastern frontier took weeks. News of Julius Caesar's assassination required months to reach the provinces. By the time distant governors learned what had happened in the capital, the political situation had already transformed multiple times. Empires adapted to this reality by delegating authority. Provincial governors operated with enormous autonomy because they had to. Waiting for instructions from the capital meant waiting until the situation had already resolved itself, one way or another. This delegation created constant tension. Autonomous governors sometimes became rebellious governors, using their distance from central authority to build independent power bases. The larger the empire, the worse the problem became. Rome eventually split into eastern and western halves partly because governing both from a single capital had become impossible. The communication lag made unified administration a fiction. The Mongols faced this problem at a scale no previous empire had attempted. Their territory was so vast that a message traveling at normal speeds might take 6 months to cross it. By the time the Khan learned about events on the empire's western frontier, half a year of consequences had already accumulated. This should have made the empire ungovernable. Every historical precedent suggested it would fragment within a generation or two, breaking into regional khanates whose rulers paid lip service to central authority while operating independently. The Mongols refused to accept this limitation. Their solution emerged from their nomadic heritage. Steppe peoples had always relied on horses for survival, and they developed techniques for covering vast distances quickly, not through riding single horses to exhaustion, but through maintaining networks of fresh mounts that allowed continuous travel. The genius was systematizing this practice. Instead of ad hoc arrangements that worked for small groups, the Mongols built permanent infrastructure. Way stations positioned at precise intervals, each maintaining a stable of fresh horses, each staffed by riders ready to carry messages at any hour. The result was a communication network that effectively shrank the empire. Distances that should have taken months could be covered in weeks. The Khan could issue an order and expect it to reach the empire's far corners before local situations had time to drift beyond recovery. This didn't eliminate the problem of distance entirely. The Mongol Empire was still too large for true centralized control, and it did eventually fragment into separate khanates. But the Yam bought time. Generations of functional unity that allowed the empire to consolidate, to develop administrative systems, to become something more than a temporary military occupation. The postal system didn't just carry messages. It carried the empire itself. The Yam operated on principles that modern logistics experts would recognize instantly. Way stations, called Ertu in Mongolian, were positioned roughly every 25 to 30 miles along the empire's major routes. This distance wasn't arbitrary. It represented the maximum a horse could gallop at speed before requiring rest. A rider arriving at a station would dismount, transfer his message pouch to a fresh horse, and continue immediately. The exhausted horse would rest at the station until the next rider needed it. The stations themselves were substantial operations. A major Ertu might maintain 200 horses, staffed by dozens of workers responsible for feeding, grooming, and caring for the animals. Smaller stations on less traveled routes kept perhaps 20 horses. The total system, at its peak, maintained somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 horses. A staggering investment of resources dedicated entirely to moving information. Riders were selected for endurance and reliability. The job was brutal, covering hundreds of miles in days, sleeping in the saddle when necessary, pushing through weather that would stop ordinary travelers. Many riders wrapped their torsos in tight bandages to cushion the impact of continuous riding. Some tied themselves to their horses to prevent falling if they lost consciousness from exhaustion. The system's speed was remarkable. A priority message could travel 200 miles in a single day, sometimes more if the terrain permitted and the rider pushed hard enough. Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, reported that urgent imperial messages covered 300 miles daily. Even accounting for exaggeration, this represents a communication speed that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph. Security was built into the system's architecture. Each rider carried a paisa, a tablet of gold, silver, or wood that served as identification and authorization. The paisa demanded cooperation from everyone who saw it: fresh horses, food, lodging, and assistance of any kind the rider required. Interfering with a yam rider was punishable by death, and the Mongols enforced this penalty with characteristic thoroughness. The routes themselves received constant maintenance. Bridges were built and rebuilt. Dangerous passes were improved. In some regions, the Mongols constructed actual roads, not common in an empire that generally preferred the steppes' natural highways. Where rivers blocked passage, ferries operated continuously. And the system ran constantly. Unlike modern postal services with their business hours and weekends, the yam never stopped. Day and night, in summer and winter, through storms and across deserts, the riders kept moving. The empire's nervous system never slept. This infrastructure wasn't cheap. The yam consumed enormous resources: horses, feed, labor, construction materials, administrative overhead. Local populations were often required to supply horses and workers as a form of taxation, a burden that generated considerable resentment. But the Mongols paid the cost without hesitation. They understood what their enemies didn't. Whoever controls information controls everything else. The yam's success depended on geography that most settled civilizations considered worthless. The Eurasian steppe, that vast grassland stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, was hostile to agriculture. The soil was thin, the rainfall unreliable, the winters brutal. Settled peoples avoided it, building their cities along rivers and coastlines where farming was possible. The Mongols saw something different. They saw a highway. The steppe's apparent emptiness was actually its greatest advantage. No forests to cut through, no mountains to climb, no swamps to drain. Just endless grassland that horses could traverse at speed, day after day, without significant obstacles. A message traveling from Karakoram to the western frontier crossed terrain that, from a communication standpoint, was nearly frictionless. The Yam stations followed the steppes' natural corridors, positioning themselves along routes that nomadic peoples had used for millennia. The infrastructure enhanced natural advantages rather than fighting against them. Compare this to communication in settled empires. A Roman messenger traveling from Rome to Antioch faced mountains, rivers, bandits, and roads that deteriorated every winter. The infrastructure was impressive by ancient standards, but it fought against geography at every step. The Mongols didn't fight geography. They leveraged it. This advantage extended beyond simple distance calculations. The steppes' openness meant that Yam riders could see approaching threats from miles away. Ambushes were nearly impossible in terrain without cover. The same visibility that made the steppe uncomfortable for farmers made it safe for messengers. The climate was harsh but predictable. Steppe peoples had developed techniques for surviving winters that would kill unprepared travelers. Yam stations were equipped to shelter riders through blizzards, with stored food and fuel sufficient for extended isolation. The system didn't fail in bad weather. It was designed to function through bad weather. Even the grass itself contributed. The steppe's vegetation supported enormous horse populations without the infrastructure that settled peoples required. Yam stations didn't need to import feed for their horses. They simply positioned themselves where natural grazing was abundant. The land itself fed the communication network. This is why the Mongol Empire's shape made strategic sense. It followed the steppe, expanding east and west along the grassland corridor where communication remained fast. The empire's southern extensions into Persia, China, and the Middle East were harder to administer precisely because they left the steppe behind. The Mongols weren't stupid about this. They understood that different terrain required different approaches. In China, they adapted existing bureaucratic systems. In Persia, they worked through local administrators. Only on the steppe itself did they rely entirely on their own methods. But the steppe remained the empire's spine. It was where the Khan's word traveled fastest, where his armies could redeploy most quickly, where Mongol power was most absolute. Geography had given them an empire-shaped highway. They built the postal system to use it. The Yam wasn't just for orders and administration. It was a military intelligence network without historical parallel. Before major campaigns, Mongol commanders received detailed briefings about their targets. Not just military information, but economic data, political structures, religious divisions, anything that might prove useful. This intelligence came from merchants who traveled the Yam routes, from spies who reported through the postal system, from diplomats whose observations were systematically collected and analyzed. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire illustrates the system's effectiveness. Before the first arrow flew, Genghis Khan knew the empire's internal politics, the disposition of its armies, the loyalties of its regional governors, the location of its treasuries. He knew which cities would resist and which might surrender. He knew where the roads were good and where they weren't. His enemies knew almost nothing about him. This intelligence asymmetry transformed warfare. Mongol armies appeared where they weren't expected, avoided prepared defenses, struck at vulnerabilities their enemies didn't know they had. Campaigns that should have taken years concluded in months, because the Mongols never wasted time attacking strong points when weak points were available. The speed of intelligence transmission meant that Mongol commanders could coordinate across distances that made coordination seem impossible. Armies separated by hundreds of miles executed synchronized attacks, converging on targets from multiple directions simultaneously. This wasn't magic. It was messaging, fast enough that commanders could plan based on information that was still current when they received it. Enemies found this coordination terrifying. Chroniclers describe the Mongols as seemingly omniscient, aware of movements and plans that should have been secret. Some attributed this knowledge to sorcery or demonic assistance. The truth was more prosaic. The Mongols had better mail service. The Yam also enabled rapid response to unexpected developments. When a campaign encountered problems, stubborn resistance, unexpected fortifications, disease, supply issues, reports reached the Khan quickly enough for strategic adjustments. Reinforcements could be redirected. Alternative approaches could be authorized. The empire's military planning was flexible because its information flow was fast. This stands in sharp contrast to other empires' military communications. Roman commanders in distant provinces made decisions based on information that might be months old by the time they acted on it. They won or lost based on their own judgment because consulting with Rome wasn't practical. Mongol commanders had options Roman generals couldn't imagine. They could request guidance and receive it while the situation remained relevant. They could report problems and expect responses that addressed current reality rather than ancient history. The Yam made the empire's military into a single coordinated organism. Its enemies remained collections of disconnected limbs. The Yam's benefits extended far beyond military applications. The system transformed the economics of Eurasian trade. Before the Mongol peace, long-distance commerce was prohibitively risky. Merchants traveling the Silk Road faced dozens of political boundaries, each with its own tolls, its own regulations, its own potential for extortion or outright robbery. A journey from China to the Mediterranean might require negotiating with 20 different authorities, any of whom might decide that confiscation was more profitable than taxation. The Mongols simplified this calculation brutally. They eliminated the competing authorities. One empire meant one set of rules, one system of tolls, one legal framework. A merchant who obtained the Khan's permission could travel from Korea to Persia without navigating political complexity. But political unification alone didn't make trade practical. The Yam did. Merchants could use the postal system's infrastructure. They couldn't commandeer horses like official messengers, but they could stay at Yam stations, access maintained roads, and travel under the system's protection. The Paisa system extended to commercial travelers, granting them security guarantees backed by Mongol military force. More importantly, the Yam enabled commercial information to travel at imperial speeds. A merchant in Samarkand could learn about prices in Beijing within weeks rather than months. Market intelligence that once took years to gather became available in real time. Traders could respond to opportunities while they still existed. This information advantage transformed what was economically possible. Goods that couldn't justify their transport costs under conditions of ignorance became profitable. When merchants knew exactly where demand existed, trade volume exploded. The Silk Road, which had limped along for centuries as a marginal economic corridor, became a genuine artery of world commerce. The Mongols taxed this commerce, of course. The empire's fiscal system depended heavily on trade revenue, a significant departure from the agricultural taxation that supported most settled empires. This created incentives to keep trade flowing. Banditry was suppressed with extreme violence because banditry threatened tax revenue. Contemporary observers marveled at the results. The famous claim that a virgin carrying gold could walk safely from one end of the empire to the other was probably exaggeration. But it captured something real. Travel under Mongol protection was genuinely safer than it had been for centuries. The economic effects rippled outward. Technologies traveled the trade routes. Chinese innovations reaching the Middle East, Persian techniques spreading to India, knowledge accumulating at a pace impossible under the fragmented political order the Mongols had replaced. The Black Death also traveled these routes, which somewhat complicates the narrative of unalloyed benefit. But that catastrophe lay in the future. For several generations, the Yam-enabled trade network represented something genuinely new. A continental economy connected fast enough to function as a single system. Information had created prosperity. The Yam's finest hours came during the empire's succession crises, moments when the system's speed meant the difference between managed transition and catastrophic fragmentation. When Ogedei Khan died in 1241, Mongol armies were deep in Europe, having just destroyed the armies of Poland and Hungary. The campaign's momentum seemed unstoppable. Vienna appeared to be next, then potentially the rest of Western Europe. Then the Yam delivered news of the Khan's death, and everything changed. Within weeks, commanders across the empire learned of the succession crisis. Batu Khan, leading the European campaign, faced a choice: continue his conquests or return east to participate in selecting the new Khan. The decision had implications for his political position, his army's future, and his personal survival. He withdrew. The European campaign ended not because of military defeat, but because political information traveled fast enough to matter. Batu needed to be present for the succession deliberations, and the Yam had told him in time to get there. This pattern repeated throughout Mongol history. The empire's political crises were contained again and again because the communication system allowed rapid response. Rebellions were suppressed before they could spread because news of them arrived quickly. Succession disputes were resolved before regional commanders could establish independent power bases because those commanders learned the outcomes before they could act on uncertainty. Compare this to the Western Roman Empire's collapse. When central authority weakened, provincial governors operated in information vacuums that lasted months or years. They made decisions based on rumors and speculation, often wrong, frequently catastrophic. The empire fragmented partly because no one knew what was happening in time to prevent it. The Mongols avoided this fate for generations, not because their leaders were wiser or their institutions stronger, but because their mail was faster. The system had limits, of course. It couldn't prevent the fundamental centrifugal forces that eventually split the empire into separate khanates. Regional identities solidified. Local interests diverged. The Yam could deliver the Khan's orders. But it couldn't force obedience when regional rulers decided that obedience wasn't in their interest. But the system bought time. It maintained functional unity long enough for the Mongol peace to transform Eurasia, for trade to flourish, for technologies to spread. The empire's eventual fragmentation was gradual rather than sudden, managed rather than chaotic. When the Golden Horde, the Shagat-ai Khanate, and the Ilkhanate emerged as independent powers, they maintained their own YAM networks. The system had become so obviously essential that even rebellious successor states preserved it. They'd learned the lesson their founder had taught: information was power. The YAM outlasted the unified empire it had made possible. History remembers Genghis Khan as a conqueror. It should remember him as a systems designer. The military campaigns get the attention because they're dramatic. Cities falling, armies destroyed, populations massacred. But the campaigns were only possible because of infrastructure that made them sustainable. Conquest without administration produces temporary occupation. Administration without effective communication produces fragmented provinces. Only the combination creates empire. The Mongols understood this in ways that their reputation obscures. Yes, they were capable of extraordinary violence. Yes, they used terror as a deliberate strategy, destroying cities that resisted to encourage surrender elsewhere. Yes, the death tolls were staggering. But violence was a tool, not a goal. The goal was control, and control required information. The bureaucrats who designed and maintained the YAM deserve credit they rarely receive. These weren't dramatic figures. No one writes epic poems about postal administrators. But they solved problems that had defeated every previous empire. They created systems that functioned across distances that should have been ungovernable. They made the impossible merely difficult. Some of these administrators were Mongol, but many weren't. The empire recruited talent wherever it found talent, and it found particularly valuable expertise among the Uyghurs and Chinese, peoples with long traditions of bureaucratic administration. The YAM incorporated techniques from multiple traditions, synthesized into something new. This pragmatic absorption of foreign expertise was itself a form of intelligence. The Mongols didn't assume they had all the answers. They identified who knew things they needed to know and put those people to work. The empire's administrative apparatus was a patchwork of borrowed systems, unified by Mongol oversight, and the communication network that made oversight possible. The results speak for themselves. For roughly a century, the largest contiguous empire in human history functioned as a coherent political unit. Trade flourished. Peace, the Pax Mongolica, prevailed across distances that had known only conflict. Technologies and ideas flowed between civilizations that had barely known each other existed. This wasn't an accident. It was engineering. The popular image of Genghis Khan, the savage destroyer, the primitive warrior who conquered through sheer ferocity, gets the story backward. The conquests succeeded precisely because they weren't primitive. They were supported by logistics, intelligence, and communication systems more sophisticated than anything the civilized empires they defeated could match. The Mongols won because they were better organized. They were better organized because they moved information faster. They moved information faster because they built a postal system that nobody else had imagined possible. It's not a romantic story. It doesn't feature individual heroism or dramatic last stands. It features way stations and fresh horses and relay riders who never stopped moving. It features bureaucrats tallying horse populations and administrators calculating optimal station spacing. But it's the true story. The empire that terrified the world was built on mail delivery. And when you understand that, you understand something important about power. It flows through the channels that carry information. Control the channels, and you control everything else. The Mongols controlled the channels. That's why they won. Queen Victoria wore white to her wedding in 1840. Everyone thinks it's ancient tradition. It isn't. Before Victoria, brides wore whatever they had, or whatever their families could afford, or whatever color happened to be fashionable that season. Red was popular in many cultures. Blue had religious significance in others. Black was practical for women who needed a dress they could wear again. The idea that white symbolized purity, that it had always symbolized purity, that proper brides had worn white since time immemorial. This is fiction, invented in the 19th century and repeated so often that it hardened into assumed fact. The real story is stranger and more interesting. It's a story about mass media, about aspiration, about how quickly manufactured customs can become traditions that people defend as sacred. It's also a story about an industry, the wedding industry, that has spent nearly 2 centuries convincing people to spend money on things their great-grandparents would have found absurd. Victoria didn't choose white because of symbolism. She chose it because she wanted to showcase the lace. Specifically, she wanted to support the English lace-making industry, which was struggling against foreign competition. The wedding dress featured elaborate Honiton lace, produced by workers in Devon whose craft the young queen wanted to promote. White silk provided the best background for displaying the lace's intricate patterns. The choice was economic and aesthetic, not symbolic. But that's not how the newspapers reported it. The press coverage of Victoria's wedding transformed a practical decision into a moral statement. White became purity. Purity became tradition. Tradition became expectation. Within a generation, middle-class brides who couldn't afford Honiton lace were nonetheless wearing white. Because that's what brides wore now. Because that's what brides had always worn. Because Queen Victoria had done it. This is how traditions get invented. Not through gradual accumulation of custom over centuries, but through sudden shifts that get retroactively justified as eternal practice. The white wedding dress is barely 180 years old. Your great-great-great-grandmother probably didn't wear one. And yet, try telling a modern bride that white is optional and watch the reaction. The historical record is clear. Before Victoria, wedding dress color was a matter of personal preference, regional custom, and economic reality. In medieval Europe, brides typically wore their best dress, whatever that happened to be. Sumptuary laws often restricted what colors and fabrics different social classes could wear, so wedding attire reflected rank as much as occasion. A peasant bride might wear brown homespun because that's what she owned. A noblewoman might wear crimson velvet because that's what her status permitted. Blue was particularly popular in many regions, associated with the Virgin Mary, and therefore carrying connotations of purity that white would later claim. Something blue in the modern wedding rhyme is a fossil of this older tradition. A remnant of a time when blue, not white, signified bridal virtue. Red dominated in many Asian cultures and carried positive associations in parts of Europe as well. Red meant luck, fertility, prosperity. A bride in red was a bride expecting good fortune. The color's association with passion and sexuality wasn't considered inappropriate. Marriage was, after all, supposed to involve both. Black was practical. A woman who could only afford one good dress needed something versatile, and black worked for weddings, funerals, church services, and formal occasions of all kinds. Scandinavian brides often wore black, as did brides in parts of Spain and Portugal. The practice continued well into the 19th century among communities that hadn't absorbed Victoria's innovation. Even white, when it appeared before Victoria, didn't carry its later symbolism. White was simply expensive. White fabric showed every stain and couldn't be worn repeatedly without obvious degradation. A bride in white was demonstrating wealth. Her family could afford a dress that would be ruined after a single use. The color signaled economic status, not sexual purity. Mary, Queen of Scots, famously wore white to her wedding in 1558, but this was considered eccentric and possibly unlucky. White was the color of mourning in the French court where she'd been raised. Her choice was a cultural statement, not a template for future brides. The diversity of pre-Victorian wedding attire reflected a fundamental truth. The wedding ceremony itself was the important thing, not the costume. Marriage was a legal and religious institution with profound implications for property, inheritance, and social standing. What the bride wore mattered far less than what the marriage contract contained. Victoria changed this. She made the dress central to the wedding's meaning. And she did it, essentially, by accident. Victoria's wedding on February 10, 1840, was the first royal event to receive truly modern media coverage. Newspapers had existed for centuries, but their reach and influence had exploded in the decades before Victoria's reign. Improved printing technology made papers cheaper. Rising literacy created new audiences. The penny press brought news to social classes that had never previously consumed it. The wedding was a sensation. Papers across Britain and Europe published detailed descriptions of the ceremony, the guests, the decorations, and especially the dress. Illustrations circulated widely, offering visual reference to readers who would never see the original. For the first time in history, a mass audience could see what a royal bride wore and imagine themselves wearing something similar. The coverage was not neutral. Victorian journalists, consciously or not, framed the white dress in terms that resonated with their era's anxieties about female virtue. White became emblematic of the purity and innocence of girlhood. The color choice was interpreted as a moral statement, a rejection of aristocratic excess in favor of modest simplicity. This framing was largely invention. Victoria's dress was hardly simple. The Honiton lace alone cost more than most families earned in years. But the narrative served purposes beyond accuracy. It gave readers a template for respectable weddings. It suggested that proper brides, regardless of their actual means, should aspire to Victoria's example. The fashion industry recognized opportunity immediately. Dressmakers began promoting white wedding gowns to middle-class customers who could never afford royal fabrics but could afford the color. Bridal magazines. Yes, they existed by the 1840s. Published patterns and advice for achieving the Victoria look on modest budgets. Within a decade, white wedding dresses had shifted from royal peculiarity to middle-class expectation. Within a generation, they'd become traditional. Within a century, they'd become so normalized that most people assumed they'd always existed. The speed of this transformation reveals something important about how traditions actually work. They don't require centuries of accumulated practice. They require mass media, aspirational marketing, and a story that connects the new custom to values people already hold. Victoria's white dress succeeded because Victorian culture was obsessed with female purity. The newspapers didn't create this obsession. They exploited it, attaching it to a fashion choice that had nothing to do with morality. The resulting fusion was so powerful that it outlived the cultural moment that created it. Modern brides don't share Victorian anxieties about sexual purity. The symbolism that supposedly justifies the white dress has largely evaporated. And yet the dress persists, defended now not as moral statement but as tradition, as if tradition were itself a sufficient reason. The newspapers made the tradition. The tradition forgot the newspapers. Where expectation exists, commerce follows. The white wedding dress created an industry that has spent nearly 2 centuries expanding its territory. The logic was seductive. If the dress mattered this much, surely other elements mattered too. The veil, the flowers, the cake, the venue, the invitations. Each component of the modern wedding was at some point elevated from optional to expected, from expected to mandatory, from mandatory to sacred tradition. The wedding industry didn't invent these elements, but it systematized them. It created packages that bundled previously separate services. It established price points that anchored consumer expectations. It manufactured urgency through the language of once-in-a-lifetime occasions that justified once-in-a-lifetime spending. The diamond engagement ring offers a parallel case study. De Beers' famous marketing campaign, A Diamond is Forever, launched in 1947, barely a century after Victoria's wedding. Before the campaign, diamond engagement rings were uncommon. After it, they became obligatory. The campaign didn't just sell diamonds. It created a tradition, complete with rules about how much the ring should cost 2 months' salary, a figure invented by advertisers. The wedding industry learned from De Beers and refined the technique. Every element of the wedding became an opportunity to establish new traditions that required new purchases. The rehearsal dinner, the bachelor and bachelorette parties, the wedding registry, the honeymoon. Each custom has a history shorter than most participants realize. The bridal magazine industry deserves particular credit, or blame, for this expansion. Publications like Bride's Magazine, founded 1934, and Modern Bride, founded 1949, served simultaneously as inspiration and instruction manual. They showed readers what weddings could look like while implying that anything less represented failure. They created aspirational standards that required substantial spending to achieve. The standards kept rising. Average wedding costs in the United States have increased faster than inflation for decades. The current average exceeds $30,000, more than many families earn in a year spent on a single day's event. This spending is often justified by reference to tradition, as if tradition demanded ice sculptures and destination venues. But the traditions being invoked are remarkably recent. Great-grandparents who married in the 1920s would recognize almost nothing about a modern American wedding except the legal paperwork. The ceremony, the reception, the attire, the customs. Nearly everything has been invented or reinvented within living memory. This isn't necessarily bad. People enjoy weddings. The spending creates employment. The rituals provide meaning. The criticism isn't that modern weddings are wrong, but that they're sold as timeless when they're actually quite new. The white dress started it. Once people accepted that a bride's costume carried moral significance, accepting significance in other elements became easy. The wedding industry has been filling that space ever since, adding traditions faster than anyone can track them. And it all traces back to a young queen who wanted to show off some lace. Victoria's innovation didn't stay in Britain. The white wedding dress conquered the world. The British Empire provided the initial vector. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and settlers carried Victorian customs to every continent. Local wedding traditions, many of them far older than Victoria's innovation, were displaced or hybridized. The white dress became a marker of civilization, of alignment with European norms, of aspiration to modernity. This cultural imperialism was often explicit. Christian missionaries in Africa and Asia promoted white wedding dresses as part of religious conversion, treating local customs as paganism to be replaced. Indigenous wedding practices that had served communities for generations were abandoned in favor of Victorian imports. The process continued long after formal colonialism ended. Hollywood became the primary vehicle for globalizing the white wedding. American films presented elaborate white dress weddings as universal aspirations, beaming Victoria's innovation into cultures that had never been British colonies. Japan offers a striking example. Traditional Japanese weddings featured elaborate kimono, often in red or other auspicious colors. The white wedding dress arrived with American influence after World War II and spread rapidly. Today, many Japanese couples have two wedding ceremonies. One traditional, one Western style, because both traditions now feel essential. China followed a similar trajectory. Red had dominated Chinese weddings for centuries, carrying connotations of luck and happiness. White, by contrast, was associated with death and mourning. But exposure to Western media shifted perceptions. Modern Chinese brides often wear red for traditional ceremonies and white for photo shoots, navigating between inherited and imported customs. The globalization wasn't always smooth. Some cultures resisted, maintaining traditional attire as markers of identity against Western homogenization. Others adapted, creating fusion styles that incorporated white elements into local dress. The outcomes varied, but Victoria's influence reached essentially everywhere. This global spread reinforces the dress's apparent universality. When brides on every continent wear white, the custom seems natural, inevitable, eternal. The relatively recent invention disappears behind the weight of apparent consensus. But consensus isn't tradition. Consensus can be manufactured, distributed, marketed. The white wedding dress proves it. A choice made by one queen, amplified by newspapers, spread by empire and Hollywood, became what everyone assumes weddings have always been. Here's the uncomfortable question. Once you know a tradition is invented, does it still work? The answer, for most people, is yes. Knowing that white wedding dresses originated with Victoria doesn't make modern brides want them less. Knowing that diamond engagement rings were created by marketing campaigns doesn't make the rings less meaningful. The traditions have accumulated enough cultural weight that their origins have become irrelevant. This isn't irrationality. Traditions serve real functions regardless of how they started. They provide scripts for navigating emotionally complex moments. They create shared experiences that connect individuals to communities. They offer aesthetic frameworks that simplify overwhelming decisions. A bride choosing a dress faces infinite options. Wear white reduces those options to something manageable. The rule may be arbitrary in origin, but it solves a real problem. Similar logic applies to every wedding tradition. Each one eliminates decisions that would otherwise require negotiation. Traditions also provide legitimacy. A wedding conducted according to recognized forms feels more real than one that improvises everything. The forms may be recent inventions, but they're forms that others recognize. They signal seriousness, commitment, alignment with broader social expectations. This doesn't mean traditions can't be questioned. The wedding industry's relentless expansion has created expectations that burden many couples. Financial pressures, family conflicts, stress that undermines the celebration it supposedly serves. Recognizing that traditions are invented opens space for deciding which inventions deserve continuation. Some couples reject the white dress entirely, choosing colors that reflect personal meaning rather than Victorian convention. Others embrace it knowingly, appreciating its aesthetic regardless of its history. Both responses are valid once you understand that tradition isn't a moral argument. The persistence of invented traditions reveals something about human psychology. We want our significant moments to connect to something larger than ourselves. Traditions provide that connection, even artificial ones. The white dress links a modern bride to millions of predecessors, not actually to medieval queens or ancient priestesses, but to other women who made the same choice in the same cultural moment. That horizontal connection across a culture matters more than the vertical connection to imaginary ancestors. When everyone you know wore white to their wedding, wearing white connects you to them. The tradition's age becomes secondary to its presence. Victoria probably didn't anticipate any of this. She wore white because of lace. But she started something that took on its own life, accumulating meaning through repetition until the meaning felt original rather than accumulated. That's how traditions work. Even the invented ones. What does the white wedding dress teach us about tradition more broadly? First, traditions can be invented rapidly and still feel ancient. The gap between Victoria's wedding and the perception of white as timeless was barely 2 generations. Cultural memory is shorter than we imagine. Customs that seem eternal often aren't. Second, mass media accelerates tradition making. Victoria's choice became universal because newspapers amplified it to mass audiences. Previous fashion innovations, even royal ones, spread slowly through limited channels. The press changed what was possible. Third, commerce has incentives to create traditions. Every new mandatory wedding element represents revenue for someone. The wedding industry didn't passively respond to customer demand. It actively shaped demand by promoting new expectations. Tradition and marketing blur together. Fourth, traditions persist through social pressure more than logical argument. Brides wear white because other brides wear white. The original reasoning has been lost. Only the practice remains. Questioning the practice requires challenging not just history, but contemporary consensus. Fifth, invented traditions can still be meaningful. The white dress provides real benefits: decision simplification, aesthetic coherence, social legibility, regardless of its origins. Dismissing it as fake misses what traditions actually do for people. These lessons apply far beyond weddings. Many customs we treat as sacred are similarly recent, similarly manufactured, similarly detached from their origins. The handshake, the national anthem, the birthday cake. Each has a history that would surprise most practitioners. This isn't cynicism. Traditions don't need ancient pedigrees to serve valuable functions. But understanding their actual histories opens space for conscious choice rather than unconscious compliance. You can wear white to your wedding because you like how it looks, because you appreciate the aesthetic tradition, because you want photographs that match expectations. These are all legitimate reasons. You can also not wear white, choosing colors with personal significance, honoring non-Western heritage, simply preferring something different. These are equally legitimate. What you probably shouldn't do is wear white, because that's what brides have always worn. They haven't. And once you know that, the choice becomes yours. Victoria's lace dress hangs in a museum now, yellowed with age. smaller than modern viewers expect. It's a historical artifact, not a sacred object. It's also the source of a tradition that billions of people assume has always existed. Both things can be true at once. The wedding rhyme everyone knows. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, is itself Victorian, appearing in print around the same time as the white dress. It's presented as ancient folk wisdom, the kind of thing grandmothers have whispered to brides since time immemorial. It isn't. Like the white dress, it's a 19th century invention that accumulated a patina of false antiquity through repetition. The rhyme's components do reference older traditions, reassembled and packaged for Victorian consumption. Something blue recalls the pre-Victorian association between blue and purity. Something borrowed may derive from customs about using items from happily married women. The individual elements have roots. The combination and the rhyme are new. This pattern, assembling fragments of older practices into new traditions, characterizes much of what we think of as timeless custom. The Victorian era was particularly prolific at this kind of invention, combining romanticism about the past with industrial era marketing techniques. Christmas, as we know it, is largely Victorian. So is the modern Halloween. So is the white wedding with all its trimmings. The 19th century manufactured traditions at industrial scale, and we're still living with the results. The white wedding dress isn't going anywhere. Too many brides want it. Too many industries depend on it. Too much cultural weight has accumulated around it. Victoria's accident has become permanent. But knowing its history changes something. It transforms a presumed requirement into an actual choice. It reveals the gap between this is what people do and this is what people have always done. It opens space for questioning other assumed traditions, other invented permanences. Something old, the human desire for ritual and meaning. Something new, the specific forms that desire takes in any given era. Something borrowed, the traditions we inherit from recent ancestors and mistake for ancient wisdom. Something blue, the color that brides wore before Victoria, now reduced to a decorative detail in a garter or ribbon. And something white, a dress that started as a showcase for lace and became what weddings mean. Traditions are made. This one was made in 1840.